Live from Shakespeare and Company in Lenox, Massachusetts. This is to establish that we are actually here and there are other people here. We're going to be talking about The Merchant of Venice today, and we are specifically going to be talking about the amazing production they're doing up here. If you think you've seen Merchant of Venice and you haven't seen this production, then you haven't entirely seen all the ways that it can be. I will say, just not to give away anything, but I think it's the only production of Merchant of Venice which opens with Uptown Funk, the Bruno Mars composition. I've seen that used in Troilus and Cressida, but not in Merchant of Venice. So let me tell you who's here. Tina Packer was the founding artistic director of Shakespeare and Company, the director of this current production of The Merchant of Venice, and she's many, many other things besides. She's been with us before. Her book, Women of Will, was sort of foundational document for us when we were doing our show about Romeo and Juliet, when that was being done by Darko at Hartford Stage Company. I should say also, so we researched you intensely, Tina.
Yes.
Were you actually in Doctor Who, like the original Doctor Who?
Oh, God. Not the original, the second one. Patrick Troughton was my Doctor Who.
But you're like nerd royalty.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, there's like people who just want to touch you.
When I was teaching at MIT, I never got any respect till they suddenly discovered I was a Doctor Who lady or whatever you want to call them.
And then they made you like a dean or something.
Yeah. Then they started listening to me.
There are people who are completely unreasonable on the subject of Doctor Who.
They are.
Yeah.
They are.
Jonathan Epstein is with us. He is the amazing Shylock in this production. It's, I think, not the first time he's done Merchant of Venice. In fact, you've done it 5 times?
This is the 5th.
Yeah. He is a 29-year veteran of this company and has acted in more places than I will name right now because then the show would be over. This production of Merchant of Venice, by the way, is running through August 21st, and you should get up and see it. It's a really fascinating kind of postmodern way of approaching this really controversial material. But the material, and I think we need to just get right into this, the material is ever going to be controversial. And I call your attention to an incident in 2013 when Tribune Media Services published in a number of its newspapers a crossword puzzle in which the clue was Shylock, and the answer, because they're always looking for those little 3-letter words in crossword puzzles, was Jew. And within hours of it appearing there, Abe Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League had written a letter in protest, calling this clue insensitive, demanding an apology. Part of his statement was, perhaps the puzzle authors were unaware of the use of Shakespeare's Shylock character throughout the years as a vehicle for anti-Semitism. Selecting Shylock to elicit the answer Jew demonstrates cultural ignorance and an extreme lack of sensitivity. Even if done inadvertently, such a linkage perpetuates classic anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews as evil and money-hungry. A lot of Jewish scholars responded to that saying it was a silly complaint. I mean, Shylock is a Jew. It doesn't really make any sense to complain that he's identified that way. But it's Tina, it's an indication of just how loaded up this material is, that even in a crossword puzzle, in a pretty harmless sounding generic context, it still lights people's fuses.
Yes, and one reason why I wanted to do it with Jonathan again, so I've only done it twice, but when I did it before, Johnny was Shylock before, so one reason I wanted to do it with him again was that I knew that we would be on a fairly even keel with this very painful material. And it's very difficult working on painful material with actors that you don't know or don't trust. So that tale you just told is legion, Colin. It comes up in every way. I also want to say, though, in this production, we're not just examining the anti-Semitism, we're examining the Semitism in as much as Shylock in many ways is the most attractive character, if I can put it like that. We're examining the sexism, we're examining, because we have 5 nationalities, 4 different ethnic groups, we're examining all the different racial disputes that come up, and it's a society built on slavery, which most productions don't normally bring out, but which I do. So it's not just the anti-Semitism, there's whole layers upon layers, and it's all a comedy, supposedly.
Right, and we want to talk about all those things, including the slavery, and I agree that in this production, Shylock is the most attractive and by far the most charismatic character.
Yes.
In fact, I became aware, I think Shylock's only on stage 5 times. I started feeling Shylock deprived because, Jonathan, you are so magnetic that when you're not on stage, I'm thinking, well, when's Shylock coming back?
Yeah.
When's Shylock back on stage? And so let's talk a little bit about how you form that role, how you form your approach. And I guess, Jonathan, do you start by interrogating Shakespeare at all? Like, what's a Jew to Shakespeare at that moment that he's writing? What's a Jew in that environment? Or are you skipping over that to something else?
Well, I think I start with the language, and I interrogate myself. The principle of the way we work is only me up here. And so I'm an absolute authority on how Shylock feels. He feels like I do. Mm-hmm. And when I say this, I feel this, that's authoritative. Mm-hmm. And then Tina will say, well, can you think also about this? And then my feeling might change. But I'm speaking out of I'm speaking specific language out of the condition I'm in. And the act of speaking the language changes my condition. So the history of Shakespeare's relationship to the Jews is something that happens when we're talking about it. When we're actually in it, it never occurs to me. I'm in the event in relationship with my scene partners and the audience, and speaking this language, which is tremendously evocative language. And honestly, as with a lot of Shakespeare, certainly King Lear would be another, certainly Othello's another, I would imagine Juliet's another. The act of speaking it, the big risk is that you become so overcome with the depth that the language gets to in your spirit that you become unable to speak. Mm-hmm. So one of the big tricks with someone like Shylock is actually keeping the language moving, because you can be made so breathless by the experience of it, and that becomes even stronger when there's an audience there who are also made breathless by it.
We should maybe just, I'm assuming we don't have to worry about spoilers with
Shakespeare.
No,
I don't think we're going to worry about that.
So maybe we should just quickly remind ourselves and remind everybody else what it is we're talking about here. So we have kind of a group of people who appear to be somewhat privileged people, if not one percenters. Antonio might be a one percenter. And so you get these privileged people. One of them, Bassanio, needs money for an errand of love. He tries to get it from his friend Antonio. Antonio has to borrow it from Shylock. He thinks he'll have no trouble paying it back, then has some reversals of fortune. Meanwhile, Shylock has set these terms that include the famous pound of flesh. Meanwhile, there's this other thing going on, this other plot going on involving this woman whose dead father has set up this bizarre game show, basically, for suitors who have to pick the right box. And a lot of it culminates in this trial scene where, in fact, Portia, the young woman, who has inserted herself as kind of a magistrate in the guise of a man, and Shylock is trying to carry out the compact that's been made. That all gets worked out. I think most people know how. And then there's this sort of other afterplot that goes on after that. Maybe we can talk about that as well. But Tina, I want to come back. I just wanted everybody to remember what's going on here. But I want to come back to that question of interrogating Shakespeare. Do you care what Shakespeare thought about all this?
Yes, I do. And I don't know that I always know, but of course I always think that I know what Shakespeare's thinking. And I'm reminded that, at this point in time when he was writing it, there had been the huge trial of Dr. Lopez, who was the Portuguese Jew, now Christianized, that was Elizabeth's doctor, and he got put on trial for treason and then executed, which I think was absolutely an anti-Semitic move on the behalf of the Earl of Essex, who went after him, and he was an easy target. So that was very much in the forefront of people's minds. Marlowe had written The Jew of Malta, which I think really is a very deeply anti-Semitic play, and it was very popular. I think that was in people's minds. And I think Shakespeare, in fact, while using some of the tools of what was going on at that time, was dead set on showing an opposite picture. And I think Shylock himself, if I can say this, ran away with the play. I don't think that Shakespeare knew that Shylock was going to dominate the play so much. And what happened was, as he started writing him, he became more and more alive in Shakespeare's imagination until he's got all the best speeches, all the best moves, and so on, and some of the most intricate psychology in the play. I don't know that Shakespeare set out Because when you're an artist, you don't you have vague ideas. You're responding to things inside yourself that kind of set off bells. You don't know how it's going to come out by the end, and I don't think Shakespeare knew how it was going to come out.
Jonathan, in some ways, Shakespeare is very interested in people who fail to match up with cultural expectations at the moment. I think you could probably put Othello in that category too. Mm-hmm. And so my reading, and particularly in this production, what my reading on Shakespeare was, or at least some voice that's inside this play is saying, well, here's the way things are. And Shylock has to put up with all this crap. He gets kicked, he gets spat on, he gets treated like a dog. And there's some kind of cultural expectation in Venice at that moment that, yeah, okay, you don't have to like it, but that's the way things are, and you can hate it, but you have to deal with it. And he basically says he is the one Jew among other Jews who are maybe going to process this a little bit differently, and maybe live with that as background radiation. And he just says, no, I am not going to live with that as background radiation. In that sense, he's, rather than the typical Jew of that moment, the atypical Jew of that moment.
And a hero.
Yes, but I think he would have lived with it. I think he's content. I think he's made a Faustian deal, which is, I'm content to be spat on and be treated as a third-class citizen, except commercially, I'm going to kick your ass. And I'm going to make my gold and silver breed like ewes and rams do, so I'm going to have power in that way. And I think the cost of it is that act dehumanizes him. I think it probably makes him a less compassionate father. And he breaks when his daughter leaves. Mm-hmm. And to me, what he realizes is, I think he imagines that he's been betrayed. Mm-hmm. Not just by his daughter, but by Antonio and Bassanio. He imagines that the whole thing was a conspiracy to get to trick him out of his money and his daughter. But that I think, certainly for me, what happens to me is I become terribly ashamed of the deal I made, which ultimately cost me my daughter in this way. And rather than repenting and thinking, how can I be a better father, or how can I make this up, I attack somebody, which really is very, very human. Rather than confront my own weakness, I attack the person who's really with whom I have the most in common. And this is, I think, a commonplace that we don't think of all the time. The people we hate the most are the people who are, at least in certain ways, most like us.
Right.
So Antonio's the other outsider. Antonio's the other person who's made a kind of Faustian deal. He's supplying his lover with the money to go and seduce somebody else, but at least it keeps him involved. It's a very Jewish thing to have done. And Shylock, instead of confronting his own mistakes, attacks someone else's.
And we should say, or remind people, that Antonio, at the very beginning of the play, sort of talked about a melancholy that he has. That's, yes. I mean, Shakespeare can't quite, I think, bring himself to say what he's saying, but that there's a melancholy that has to do with his feelings for Bassanio, the young lover who will eventually court Portia. And, in my synopsis, I left out Jessica. So that is the other thing that happens, is that Shylock's daughter runs off with a non-Jew and takes quite a bit of his ducats. So sort of hits him in two different places at once, yes. The heart and the pocketbook. Just
while you're mentioning Antonio in that context, it's very interesting when you look at the very beginning of a Shakespeare play. Who's there? Nay, answer me. That's the beginning of Hamlet. Who's there is the question. And Antonio poses this question, what stuff 'tis made of, meaning his sadness, whereof it is born, I am to learn. And that's the nature of the play Merchant of Venice to me, is that we're learning more and more about ourselves and more about each other. And he understands that the process will be painful, as we understand that the process is going to have some pain in it of seeing or putting on a play like this. But I am to learn is the quest of the play, and it has the noble. You experience the sense of nobility that the word quest invokes.
So many places I want to go. First of all, I want to remind people we're up at Shakespeare and Company in Lenox, and to that point, I think if you went out on the street, maybe not the streets of Lenox, where people are highly sophisticated and living, within a stone's throw of Shakespeare and company, but out on the average street and ask people who is the Merchant of Venice, they'd say Shylock. I think most people, they don't think it's Antonio.
And it's the first thing Portia asks when she comes into the courtroom, which is the merchant here and which the Jew. And she doesn't know which one is which.
Right.
And you have to be pretty dense not to know which is which, but she doesn't know which is which.
I want to talk about money for just a second here, because there's a lot of ways to look at the money in this play. And we keep trying to do this show about cultural interpretations of the 2008 financial crisis, where Americans, for the first time maybe in a long time, started to see money as dangerous. So people started making movies like The Big Short and 99 Houses and documentaries about the financial crisis. And, this is kind of The Big Short. One thing that I read, I was reading this book, it's not out yet. It's called Shakespeare in Swaziland by Edmund Wilson Lee. It's about how Shakespeare's been produced in Africa over the years. And when they do Merchant in Africa, the first president of Tanzania took it upon himself to translate Merchant of Venice into Swahili. That's how important he thought it was. But at that time, there
Julius Nyerere, I remember. I remember well,
how would you remember a thing like that?
Yeah.
How would you remember that?
Well, how could I remember that? Because I remember always when something like that happens, and we have somebody in the audience right over there who does Shakespeare in Africa as well. So Bella Merlin, who plays Nerissa, also knows about this world. So,
And so, certainly at that moment anyway, at least according to scholarship, the Jewish part of this play wouldn't be read the same way, simply because even at that time there wouldn't have been that kind of a population. And that Nyeri and others who are basically trying to incorporate some Marxist ideas into the transfer from a colonial government into independence. But they're much more interested in this. It's a play about money. It's about people who attempt to profiteer and create wealth out of nothing. And they don't really care that it's somebody Jewish, right? It's a play for them about money. I don't know if you want to elaborate. You're nodding. That means you do.
No, but I don't particularly want to elaborate about Nyerere, but he was a school teacher before he became a Marxist. So he actually had been in the classroom. So I just want to say that. I don't want to elaborate particularly about him. What I do know is that at every turn, Shakespeare has been used by different countries to actually illuminate and the one I like the story the best is about, César rewriting The Tempest, and Caliban, at the end of the play set in the West Indies, Prospero is trying to find a name for Caliban, and Caliban says, well, you've stolen everything from me, including my name, why don't you call me X? And Malcolm X took his name from Caliban's X in that particular translation. So I feel as if Shakespeare goes out over the world, and that's one of the reasons why Shakespeare should be the world book rather than the Bible or the Quran or any of those other things.
So, but Jonathan, if you were to take all references to Jewish identity out of this play, now it's a play about Goldman Sachs, really, in Venice. It's about people who maybe have no business complaining because they're already pretty privileged anyway. I mean, the people who are doing the complaining. But they don't like it, right? They don't like it that this guy can jerk them around at the level of money, even though he's not really selling them anything or making them anything.
Honestly, it's a failure of imagination. The argument comes between taking interest and venture capitalism. And venture capitalism is legal. If I invest in your voyage, I'm entitled to a share of the profits. Interest is a way of diversifying investment. And without it, what you get is class structure and stagnation, because if you have no money, you have no way of ever getting any money. Whereas if you're able to invest at a fee, then you're able to create capital. So it's a very odd distinction, which in the Elizabethan world was being bent all the time. There would be phony ventures, which were really a way of charging interest. And there were some people who charged the legal level of interest, which I think was either 4 or 6%, but it was in fact venture capitalism. So yes, but what happens is it becomes personal. So it's not quite, in that sense, it's not quite Goldman Sachs, because it's so hard to distinguish the personalities.
Right. The other thing that you were just describing, the phony ventures,
Yes.
that does sound like Elizabethan credit default swaps.
Yes,
basically,
exactly.
We do have to take a little break here. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back. We have a wonderful conversation going, and there's a lot more of it to come. So stay with us. Yeah, Lennox. Woo. All right, we're live from Lenox, Massachusetts at Shakespeare and Company. We're in a rehearsal room as opposed to you got to go to the theater. Amazing renovation of that theater. It's an exciting place just to sit and look around you. And then when you go to Merchant of Venice, which is running through August 21st, is that how long it goes?
That's right.
August 21st. I mean, the actors sit down next to you in the audience. So you get visited in all kinds of interesting ways. So we're talking about Merchant of Venice. Let's hone in a little bit more on the real problem. So Tina, I was up here last Friday night. There were people sitting behind me who were pretty clearly Jewish and who just weren't having it. They just weren't having it. And at the end, I heard them talking among themselves, and they were saying, no, this is about a bunch of one percenters, who are essentially taking advantage of a Jew and whom they've already tormented for most of his adult life, and this is supposed to be some kind of happy ending at the end where everything he has in the world is taken from him and he's fed this very bitter cup of wormwood. And so why are we even here? I mean, they just weren't having it, and that's not an uncommon reaction, right?
Well, but Shakespeare wrote in Act 5, Shylock is not in Act 5. Mm-hmm. That's the end of that portion of the story, and now we're going to resolve what the lovers do, which is the framework. He calls it a comedy, and the lovers include his daughter Jessica, and how is this relationship with her Christian husband going to resolve, which is a very bittersweet kind of resolution. How Bassanio, who is clearly bisexual, how is his relationship with his now heterosexual partner, but both of his partners, you might notice, were very, very rich, so there seems to be a common factor in that. How is that going to resolve between these two people? And how is the bigot Graciano and the lady-in-waiting Nerissa, how is their relationship going to resolve? So Act 5 is meant to be about the resolution of those lovers and what it is that Shakespeare's written about that. And there's no easy answer for them either. I just want to say in our production, the last moment is Shylock's. Mm-hmm. It's Shylock's and Jessica's, because he's so powerful, you can't help but think about him as you're going into Act 5. Right at the very end of this, what we hear as Lorenzo and Jessica are struggling with, how do we make this relationship work? And they come to some kind of understanding that there is maybe a place, in the expansion of who they are, they can make it work. We hear Shylock singing the Col Nidre, but it's almost in Jessica's imagination rather than Shylock being there, and that puts a whole different spin on the play. Did they do that in Shakespeare's time? I doubt it, but we don't know, because we don't know what the music was in Shakespeare's plays, except in a couple of instances, because the orchestra was improvising with the plays all the time, so we don't know what they wrote.
It's interesting because a number of people, as they hear that, I had a completely different reaction to that than the person who was with me, and as far as I could tell, most people who hear that, and there have been sort of other versions of this play where things like that have been attempted, and most people assume that it means that Shylock is dead. And it never occurred to me that Shylock was dead. I thought, no, he's dead in his soul. This is the cost of all this happiness, that in fact he's been killed, in an internal spiritual way, that he's had to die for everybody else to have these chances to be happy. I don't know. How do you process that?
Well, I just want to go back to your colleagues there. They had exactly the right reaction, which is, I'm not having it. Mm-hmm. Here we are back in Downton Abbey land. Mm-hmm. But I can't enjoy the romance of it or the wit of it, because there's this huge injustice that everybody's pretending didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So when people say, well, the ending doesn't work, no, the ending works great. Mm. What you find is that romance doesn't please you when you know it's founded upon injustice and cruelty. So the response they had was an outstanding one. They just thought, well, no, it's the play's fault, but actually it's what they were experiencing, I think, is exactly what we'd like people to experience, which is you can't have romance if it's founded on injustice. And it's not just anti-Semitic injustice, it's other kinds of prejudice that create injustice and imbalances. Your response to Shylock, yes, I think I like that very much. The Kol Nidre is a very odd piece of liturgy because it's not a prayer at all. It'll affect a Jew who was raised in a traditional household, as I was, probably more strongly than any other piece of the liturgy, except perhaps the Mourner's Kaddish. But notwithstanding that, it's not a prayer. It's something that's put in the liturgy to exempt you from having to forswear yourself. It specifically says, vows that I take having to do with my relationship to God and so forth, from now until next year, don't count. And the tragedy of it is that it moves us so much because it's been such a necessary part of our culture since the 11th century when it was written. Our word is only good up to a point. And for the people of the book, that's a tremendous tragedy. The idea that what I say is only good up to a point. It isn't true all the way down to the center. That it's, in this sense, negotiable. That's the tragedy of Kol Nidre. But you're quite right. It's not a mourner's prayer at all. It's said yearly on Yom Kippur, right before the Yom Kippur services start. Many productions end with a mourner's prayer. In traditional Judaism, someone who leaves the religion is mourned as if they were dead. But the idea of mourning Jessica really never occurred to either me or Tina, I don't think. This seems much more appropriate.
First of all, I love the way that you just said this. Yeah, yes, you're not having it. You shouldn't be having it. And I think that's driven home by who the rest of these people are. I mean, we've all managed to various ways to slight them in our description of them. To me, they're these trust fund punks that I see in Chelsea or the Lower East Side, kind of running around, eating at really expensive restaurants and living in $10,000 apartments that they're paying, that their parents are, $10,000 a month, apartments that their parents are paying for. That's who I think I'm seeing. And just that, the kind of party atmosphere that you set up at the beginning, Tina, seems to suggest that, too.
No, I agree with you. What I do think is, though, even those people, in my socialist background, I just want to damn them. I actually think Shakespeare's saying they too have souls. They too still have to work out how these marriages are going to work. And what else can we do other than laugh? And we need to laugh in order to move on. And, I'm not without hope that Jessica and Shylock might not be reconciled and that he might not move and she might not move and they might, in fact, be pioneers in multiracial marriages or whatever it's called.
Yeah. So you're saying if you prick Brooklyn hipsters, they also bleed?
Yes,
but they bleed artisanally. Much though my prejudice is otherwise, yeah.
But I know
it would be fun to try each one of them. Anyway,
yeah.
Well, you bleed, okay.
But I also know the actors who are playing them, and I know what stupendous human beings they are. And each of them has a life story that they bring into the arena of playing those parts. So I know the soul of those characters lies with the actors, and I love those actors. And so for me, there's always this kind of dual reality going on all the time. There's the artist who's playing the part, and there's the part. And one of the great things about theater is you constantly go deeper into who people are than you do in everyday life. And therefore you can see all kinds of human beings with a much, much greater humanity on stage than you do in your exchange with them, especially if they're doing something that you don't like,
I think the other thing that I started to think about in this production, and I think, Jonathan, it's in your mind too, is, there's a Trump joke. There's a Trump joke in the production. We won't tell you what it is, but there's a Trump joke. And I laughed. But I also started thinking, well, yeah, so who's a Jew now? Who in 2016 is what a Jew is to these characters? And I'll just let you pick up that baton and run.
Well, certainly, I would think an immigrant from any of the Arabic countries would be a Jew in the sense that you mean.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that the Native American in America is a Jew in the sense that he's someone or she's someone who's categorized in a way that blinds us to seeing who it is we're speaking to. And I directed Macbeth this year, and my Lady Macbeth is part Native American. God, it hurt to see how much passion Danielle Ranella, lovely young actress, how much passion and intelligence and versatility she had, and how rapidly she's categorized in some other way. Certainly an African American. Actually, the first Shylock at Shakespeare and Company wasn't me at all. It was a wonderful African American actor, John Douglas Thompson, who did it in '94, directed by my not quite yet wife Ariel Bach in the Oxford Court, and it was really gorgeous. It was done outdoors. Mm-hmm. His knife was a butter knife. He was scary anyway.
I read a piece, Tina, about a guy, I think he became president of Drexel, but he talked about teaching Merchant of Venice. And when he first, over 20, 25 years. And so when he first starts teaching it, he's got pretty much all white classrooms, people who are very even familiar with that idea, the stereotype of a Jew. They've heard that stereotype, not as something maybe they at family gatherings they've heard that. So they're okay with damning Shylock. They're okay with coming down on him very hard. And this guy said as his classrooms got more diverse through the years, the more it had all kinds of people of color from all kinds of different national and racial backgrounds, many of whom were literally familiar with having been spat upon or kicked or treated like dogs. And that he said that his job changed. Like initially he had to get these rather privileged white kids to understand Shylock's point of view. He said his job eventually transformed into getting this incredibly diverse classroom, which understood immediately how to sympathize with Shylock, how to get them to do the other thing that you just talked about, which is to see some other point of view besides that one.
And it was one reason why I wanted a multiracial, multicultural cast, was because I wanted to know what the actors would bring to what it was that we were doing. And I just want to point out, the actor who plays Lorenzo is African American, the actor who plays Lancelot is African American, but one is a light-skinned black man, one's a dark-skinned black man. And so as they were working, one of the things that they discovered was they're both in love with Jessica, and that this kind of rivalry builds up between them. And then towards the end, when Lorenzo is really fed up with Lancelot's messing around, he gives him an order, and Lancelot, absolutely rebels. And we go into this power struggle that's very brief, and it kind of stops the play for a moment about what the hell is going on. But you suddenly see that Shakespeare has written a struggle between a master and a servant, which is standard commedia kind of theatrical. But because of the actors who are playing it, it gets translated into an incredibly potent, really heart-rendering moment as Lorenzo shames Lancelot and makes him do what it is that he has him do. And then because Lancelot's the clown, after almost smashing Lorenzo's head in, he then skips off, which kind of puts it back in, we're in the theater again. So there's things like that. The fact that, Antonio at the top of the play says he knows not why he's so sad. But the first thing Portia says, which most people don't notice, is, my little body is aweary of this world. She's as sick at heart as Antonio is. And for a lot the same reason, not having a person that she wants to love. And she's kind of tearing her skin off her. And so they recognize each other in a very peculiar way, the two lovers of Bassanio, if I can put it like that. So these are all things that the actors brought out as they were rehearsing this. All I would do is, kind of drop in the text and see where it came out with them. And it's one of the reasons why I hope we're going to be doing Shakespeare plays forever, because it actually allows us to bring up all this stuff that we don't necessarily talk about in our everyday lives.
The other person who's thinking a lot about that is Shylock. And this teacher said that when he had the more diverse international classroom, when they get to the part where Shylock says, well, you have many among you a slave, who you treat like a dog or a mule because you purchased them and I purchased this other thing and blah, blah, blah. And they go, wait a minute. These students would go, they have slaves?
Yes.
And they're taking some kind of moral high ground with this guy?
Yes.
And they have slaves? and I think Shylock, that's what he's saying too, right?
Right.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's why we put the slave on stage, so it actually is manifested there. And it's, for me, one of the most powerful moments. Of course, as we've been playing it, it has been the production from hell as far as outside events are concerned. So at every turn, every time there was a new murder, every time another policeman was gunned down, every time somebody was shot in the parking mall, we had to stop and talk about it because we needed to process it enough that we could go on. And every time there was overt symbols of racism out there, we just had to stop. And the terrorist attacks, it was hard. On the other hand, it was enriching what we did all the time as well, if I can put it like that. I don't want that to sound callous, but it was informing us. So, and people had different reactions to what was going on. So it was very much a part of our rehearsal process.
Certainly, when we undertook it, the role of the immigrant in our society was very much at the fore.
Yeah.
And so the idea that we need to wrestle with what it means, our society has never not been enriched by an immigrant population, from Irish in 47 to the Italians, to the Jews, and two different influxes, to Hispanic, to Vietnamese,
and the African Americans building the country and never being acknowledged for it.
And so this play, which is about the role of the outsider in society, where it's clear that the outsider is essential to the society and still ostracized to the extent to which they are, that was really essential. But there are lines now when we see how much violence begets violence. Lines like, the villainy you teach me, I will execute, which are so sad that it's actually hard. It's hard for me to say that even just sitting here. Very, very hard in the context of the production, because it's such a sad truth that we do what we're taught. And if we teach people the way of the gun, then they learn the way of the gun. So it's very, very current and present.
We're going to take a break right now. I do want to say, once again, we're at the beautiful campus of Shakespeare and Company. They're incredible theater there. You ought to come up and see Merchant of Venice. They got lots of other plays up here that I have not seen, but I would like to come back and see more of them. This is a great play. We're talking about the very serious and painful parts of it. It manages to be serious and painful, but also a lot of fun. There's also sort of great music and singing, and you're at a really good party that you realize has kind of a nasty thing at its core, but you're still at a really great party. Anyway, we'll take a break. We'll come back. We'll talk more about that party after this. Yeah, they're so good about clapping. Look at this. So here we go. Everybody ready? 3, 2, 1. Live from Shakespeare and Company and this great audience of extremely attractive Berkshire people. We are talking about Merchant of Venice with the people doing Merchant of Venice. Tina Packer, who is directing Merchant of Venice up here. Jonathan Epstein, who is incarnating Shylock up here. And we have one little more segment to go. Tina, I know just as we were rounding out the last segment there, you had something else you wanted to say about Shylock as teacher.
Yes, because one of the things that Jonathan does, which I think is one of the best elements of the whole production, is that he's actually teaching us all the time. So in the, he's got a couple of famous speeches that he's doing, but he brings it out to the audiences and actually asking the whole audience, why is it that you are feeling about me like this, and so the hath not a Jew eyes speech all goes out to the audience as well as the people that are surrounding him on stage. And what you see as Shylock makes his way is that he's the principal teacher on stage. So all his rhetorical persuasion comes in the form of questions, and you really are forced to ask yourself those questions, which he principally puts to the audience. He's the one who's moving us into, and so when we say, was Shylock anti-Semitic? I don't think he was, because he was making Shylock his chief teacher, just in the way that his speeches are structured.
Well, it's also that whole idea, once again, where you show it and who you show it to, it changes its spots a little bit. So one thing that I discovered was the Nazis really liked Shakespeare, and they were fine. They were encouraged the staging of Shakespeare. They didn't like this play, and by 1938 they had banned it, removed it from libraries, and they didn't like "Hath Not a Jew Eyes" because they really didn't want that speech. They couldn't cut it because, as we said, Shylock only comes on stage 5 times. They didn't think they could cut it. They didn't like the speech, and they also didn't like the intermarriage. Those two things made them. They thought this was this very radical play about Jews getting out of control.
Yes, yeah. And then Germany's blessed with one of the great literary accomplishments ever, which is a really great translation of Shakespeare, the Schlegel translation. When I was a younger actor and I would get stuck on something, I would often go to the Schlegel, because my German in those days wasn't bad, and reading it in German would help me understand. Sometimes the German is actually stronger. Shylock says, "You knew." None so well, none so. You knew is a really hard thing to say, and in German it's "ihr wusstet." Which is a combination of a growl and a hiss. And I wish I could do it, but everyone would go, Gesundheit. They would have no idea what I was talking about. But yes, you're right. They knew well that if you do this play, you come out of it more philo-Semitic than you went in, not more anti-Semitic. And it really doesn't matter how viciously you portray Shylock. He's the one, I would make a strong argument for Portia too, whose soul draws you in, especially Tamara Hickey's this unbelievable actress playing Portia, and you get the predicament that she finds herself in, that she works her way through. But they were wise not to let even Jesus, which was a piece of propaganda, did them more harm than good, I'm happy to say.
We're nearing the end of our conversation, which I kind of can't believe. I feel like we just got started talking. But I want to just talk a little bit about what the heck kind of play is this anyway? I mean, we've got comedies, we've got tragedies. This, at least on its face, is a comedy, although kind of a romantic comedy. Although there's a guy with a knife threatening to cut, somebody's vital organs out, which I've seen all those Meg Ryan movies. That never happens in any of them. So there are some other plays, Tina, that straddle, right?
Yes. There are some other plays that straddle, but none straddle like this. I mean, he calls it a comedy. It was published as one of the comedies, and yet it is so clearly a tragedy. Or at least the actions in the play all lead towards infinite pain in all kinds of ways, mostly in what happens to Shylock, but not just in what happens to Shylock. Everybody ends up with big questions about their life. So I think he thought, I'll write a comedy that sells really well. I'm going to say the things I want to. And I think Shakespeare It's a kind of 94, it's written 95, 96 maybe. It's at a moment before he writes the great tragedies, and I think this play leads him towards the great tragedies. I think by writing this, he suddenly was able to get the breadth of what it was that was possible for him to do. But it's so I say, it's a tragicomedy, and the two, by us playing them so extremely, I think we throw the audience around a bit in where their emotional response can land. In fact, it can't land.
I mean, there are other plays like Measure for Measure where there's a lot on the line, right? I mean, there's bad stuff can happen to people.
Yeah.
But a lot of those plays seem to be the later plays, right? Towards the end, he started thinking, well, things don't have to be a tragedy or a comedy.
Yeah.
I can do A Winter's Tale or something like that.
And where do you put Troilus and Cressida?
Right.
And so I think he liked uncategorizable plays. I think his own mind led him there. His inquiring mind led him there.
And but that leads to a question, Jonathan, about the ending. Okay, so that we talked a lot about the ending already and the way that this particular production ends. Although it doesn't really end there with the Kol Nidre, because the next thing that happens is this very merry music strikes up, and everybody gets happy again and does this. Maybe my favorite curtain call I've seen in the last 5 years. It's a really great curtain call.
It's essential that you dance.
Yeah.
There's only one contemporary description of a Shakespeare play performed by his company. Only one. A Swiss guy went, yesterday afternoon, I and my company went across the river to the Straw Roof Playhouse, and we saw a play, which I won't name right now, performed by 12 or 14 men, dressed as women also, and at the end they danced very harmoniously together. That was a guy's description of William Shakespeare playing Julius Caesar. What he remembered was the dancing. So if they danced in Julius Caesar, they danced all the time. And it was essential that that a dance is circular, a dance has a beginning and an ending, but it keeps going. A dance has to do with music, and a dance has to do with giving back to the audience the excitement you experienced from having them there in the first place. And so I'm so happy. I always end my Shakespeare plays with dances, and I learned it from Tina, who always does the same.
But I think it also says something about an ending, too. I mean, one of the things that we as modernists of 2016 are encouraged to do is to think what happens next. How will things work out for Jessica and Lorenzo? How are things going to work out for everybody? But I don't think that that's what Shakespeare does, right? I think things are a snapshot, and the camera goes off right there, and that's where it stops.
Yes, I think all really good actors are very polite when people ask, well, what happens to Shylock? Because all really good actors know, well, the play's over. Nothing else happens. That's it. That's what you get, I did want to say one thing. You're talking about tragedy. It's tragic in this sense that in a great tragedy, I'm aware that I'm in a room with 3 King Lears. Dennis Krausnicki is here, Ava Lindenmeyer is here, and I've done Lear. That the central character, in fact, many central characters, become completely human just a second too late. And what redeems them is the fact, not that it's too late, but that they do become completely human. And I think that there's a moment of deep humanity for Shylock when Antonio says, I'm going to give you half the money back. If I can have the other half in use, I'll pay you interest, and I'm going to give it to your daughter at the, and there's a moment of real, and then Antonio springs the big trap, and that poisons everything, but there's a moment of really great humanity right near the end, and it's just too late for it to be enjoyed. The same thing, I think, happens to Lear. The same thing happens to Hamlet. Certainly the same thing happens to Brutus, and I think obviously happens to Romeo and Juliet as well. And it's a redemptive moment because it's a moment of such great humanity.
So at the beginning of this conversation, I was really sort of, as I was driving back from here, so we had a long drive back from Lenox down to Hartford, and I was thinking, I understood those people sitting behind me, who I think, if I had them here to ask them, would say, no, don't do this play anymore. Don't do it. Never do it again. There's just, in this world that we're in, Steven Spielberg gave the commencement address at Harvard this year. He said, I thought anti-Semitism was over or almost over. It's not. 20,000 Jews have left Europe in the last year, and so there are people who say, look, in this world, this dangerous, volatile world, don't do this play. But Tina, I feel like the conversation we just had is a conversation about doing this play.
Yeah, I think it's the greatest instrument to bring up the conversation, and the fact that people have different points of view, the fact that their life histories are different that they're bringing to the question, and the fact that we're talking about it. How else are we going to get through anti-Semitism or sexism or anything except by talking about it? You cannot bomb people into submission or to changing their thinking.
I have to do some quick curtain calls. You guys either can bow or not, but Jonathan McNichol was the producer of the show, is the producer of this particular episode of this show. Jonathan, you are getting a curtain call. Our senior producer, Betsy Kaplan, she's on the board making this whole thing sound great. Betsy Kaplan. Our interns, Adriana Smith and Esther Shitu, also are here with us, helping us. So thank you very much to all of you. And I want to thank this wonderful panel. And thank you, audience, for coming out here. Give yourselves a big hand.
Thank you.
All that stuff. Great show.
Thank you.
Thanks for doing this. You guys are great.
To talk to someone who's actually seen the play. You have no idea how rare that is.